All right. Welcome back, everyone, to another book seminar of the Hague Program on International Cybersecurity. To those of you who don't know us, we are the program situated in The Hague, where we're talking a lot about or doing a lot of research on international cybersecurity. And we have this monthly book seminar series where we invite an author who has written something on international cybersecurity or related to present their work. And today I'm very happy to welcome Professor Ahsley Deeks to talk a bit about her new book, which is called The Double Black Box: National Security, Artificial Intelligence, and the Struggle for Democratic Accountability. Professor Deeks is a highly accomplished international lawyer. She's currently professor of law at University of Virginia School of Law. She's also a member of the US State Department Advisory Committee on International Law. From 2021 to 2022, she was also deputy legal advisor at the US National Security Council. And before joining UVA, Professor Deeks served for 10 years in the US State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor. She is therefore but she's not only highly accomplished as a practitioner in the field of international law and national security, she's also published widely on international law more broadly, intelligence and state secrecy, as well as emerging technologies. And today we're really happy to hear her talk about her new book, as I said, The Double Black Box. So how this usually goes is we have around 20 to 30 minutes of presentation by the author, so by Professor Deeks, followed by a Q&A. So in case you have any questions to Professor Deeks, feel free to raise your hand and ask your question directly, or feel free to also put it in the chat box that is also open for any questions you may have, and I'm happy to read them out loud for you as well. So I think that's it from my end. So without further ado, I'm happy to give the floor now to Professor Deeks, and thank you once again to joining us for this seminar.
Isabella, thank you very much for having me here and for the kind introduction. I'm excited to talk about my new book, which has been out for now a little while, although people have been having a hard time getting Oxford to actually send it to them. So hopefully that will clear up soon. As you all know, we have seen an exponential focus in the news and within governments and within parliaments in the past couple of years about public uses of AI, whether by companies or by individuals and by governments themselves. The area that my book focuses on is related to that, but it's a little bit different because I'm really interested in the uses of AI that are taking place behind the veil of classification inside governments. Our national security agencies, and when I say our, I mean the US, but also a range of other countries, their national security operations occur in what's really a national security black box. And those agencies, I think, are increasingly using tools that many have described as an AI black box. And so what I want to do today, and I do try to do in the book, is explain why combining those two black boxes makes it harder to ensure that our governments are only doing things that comport with our public law values. So I think we need to figure out how different actors can help ensure that our governments are only deploying AI that is lawful, that is effective, that is accountable, even when they're operating inside the double black box. And I will mostly use the US today to illustrate my points while recognizing that European allies have both similarities and differences in their governmental structures. But hopefully there are enough similarities that my points will resonate with those who live in democracies that worry about unsupervised governmental power. And then I'll conclude with a few brief thoughts about why international regulation in this space is, in my view, not likely to do all that much to mitigate the double black box. So let me start with the national security black box. As you probably know quite well, in the US and in many other states, the government makes its national security decisions in secret. This is true most obviously for operations by defense and intelligence agencies, but also true often for ministries of justice or foreign affairs, homeland security. They are guided by sensitive intelligence in making their decisions. Their activities sometimes use sensitive technologies. And so the government has to keep that intelligence and those technologies and operations secret from adversaries in order for them to be effective. But that means, of course, that the government also ends up keeping them secret, has to keep them secret from its own public. And so that means that it is hard to oversee the executive. And so I think it's fair to say that our national security agencies operate inside a national security black box. So why is that a concern? Why do we care about that? When we worry about government secrecy, what we're usually worried about, I think, is whether our government is complying with public law values. And by that term, I'm basically mean to refer to the idea that government officials are adopting policies or undertaking operations that are legal, that are done in a way that is efficient and effective, that the officials must justify those decisions to some other actor, and that they're done in a way that lets us hold the decision makers accountable for bad choices. This is not, to be clear, an argument that if executive officials act with bad intent or incompetence as a matter of course. I don't think they do. I have spent, as Isabel noted, a number of years in government, and I don't think that's true. But history, of course, is rife with examples of where governments can drift off course. Secrecy can facilitate sloppiness, it can facilitate groupthink, other confounding habits. And I think we have to assume that government officials who are engaged in national security activities suffer from the same kinds of cognitive biases that we all experience, which can be heightened in operating environments that are infused with secrecy. So that is why we all think, many people think, we need oversight over the executive and its national security actions. But the nature of this national security black box makes this hard. Parliaments and courts, I think, are the kind of most obvious, most traditional secrecy surrogates for us here, but they're quite imperfect. In the United States, Congress's Intelligence and Armed Services Committees do provide important oversight over our intelligence and military and national security activities, but the members of Congress can only know what the executive is willing to tell them. Members of Congress and their staff often have less expertise in these areas than the executives do, and they have far less staffing than they probably need to oversee the executive. So that's Congress. The courts, really, in the US anyway, can provide only limited oversight over these activities. Not only do they have to wait for cases, they can't seek out cases where they think something's gone wrong. They have to wait for a plaintiff. And when they do hear cases, they really generally accord the executive significant deference in the national security space. And I'm happy to say more about that in questions. I do think that there are some other less well appreciated actors who can help check the national security executive, though. None of them is perfect or comprehensive, but they can sometimes see behind this veil of secrecy. First, we have foreign allies who can impose legal and policy constraints on the US executive when the US and its ally are engaged in classified joint operations. Maybe counterintuitively, I think executive branch lawyers can pose an important check here. We know, for example, that there's such a thing as an interagency lawyers group that usually reviews key intelligence and military actions before the president signs off on them. I think interagency negotiations and competition among lawyers can serve as important checks behind the veil of secrecy. We also have in our federalist system, US states and localities who are doing some interesting work here. They have to work with our federal government on things like counterterrorism, on election security, and on cyber threats. And I think states can and do sometimes question the legal basis or the sort of policy wisdom of particular plans that the federal government may have. And to date, in the US anyway, the states have moved more quickly than the federal government in regulating AI tools such as facial recognition software. We also have technology companies, especially in the cyber setting. I know cyber is a particular interest to this group. You have companies like Microsoft or Mandiant gathering what is effectively intelligence, right? Identifying who's engaged in particular cyber operations. They share their intelligence often with the government, and they can also test the quality of the intelligence that the government may share back to them. Finally, we have actors like leakers and whistleblowers who have been around a long time and can do some important work here, even as we recognize that leakers are generally doing something unlawful. So in short, we have lots of very significant US national security activity happening every day, but the secret nature of it really makes it hard to assess whether the government's complying with our public law values. We do have various types of checks, but each of them is impartial, is imperfect and only partial. So then into that, we introduce AI. So AI tools, especially advanced tools, are being able to produce increasingly accurate predictions and recommendations, but they are still making harmful errors. And of course, it's very hard for people to know how and why large language models or deep neural nets are making their determinations. So they are somewhat notoriously known as black boxes. And unlike traditional military tools, such as long-range missiles, for example, which generally do as they're programmed, these AI systems can be built to learn on their own. So I think we're starting to see militaries and intelligence agencies using AI in their operations. Militaries, of course, need to make predictions and detect anomalies during armed conflict, right? They need to try to figure out who's dangerous. Should we detain this person? Should we target him? Where should we patrol today? What is the adversary likely to do next? Those are all questions that AI might be suited to answer. Counterintelligence operations. You could imagine our CIA, our Department of Justice, looking to use advanced machine learning to try to determine patterns of life and figure out who suspected spies are, right? And try to arrest them. Cyber autonomy. This group probably knows more about cyber autonomy than I do. But autonomous cyber tools can hunt out vulnerabilities in the government's own systems and systems of adversaries. And I think AI in the cyber setting is going to be really attractive because the US government and its allies will need such speed in response to incoming cyber attacks. But you can also imagine a clash of cyber tools from two sophisticated cyber states escalating into a full-blown conflict accidentally. And finally, of course, lethal autonomous weapon systems. States are already using loitering munitions, it appears, that can be launched, told to find a given target profile and dive bomb it without checking back in. I think we're seeing developments like this in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And we know that our Department of Defense here in the US is pursuing what they call vast AI fleets. This is the Replicator initiative that it announced a couple of years ago. Okay, so let me now turn to the double black box. Where does this all leave us? If we are already worried about the government doing things in secret that are hard for us as citizens to know about and evaluate, what happens when national security decision makers start to use tools that we, and maybe also they, may not be able to interpret or understand particularly well? We have actors who are already operating outside of the public eye, making decisions that are going to be deeply informed by AI. And in some cases, the AI systems themselves may even be the actual decision maker that instigates a particular action. So we might say that we are ending up in a double black box. In terms of legality, right, the first public law value that I focus on, the difficulties that we have today in identifying unlawful executive branch activities, I think will be amplified by the challenges of understanding whether a particular use of an AI tool complies with the law. In terms of effectiveness, the difficulty that outside observers have, or even actors like Congress have in obtaining enough information to assess whether a particular national security policy choice is optimal is going to be compounded by the difficulty in understanding the quality of the AI recommendations and predictions that are now informing those choices. In terms of accountability, the difficulty in deciding who is responsible for an illegal or ill-advised policy choice is going to be amplified by the challenge of determining who's responsible for significant algorithmic errors that might happen. And in terms of the need to justify decisions, the ease with which the executive can avoid defending its national security decisions due to classification in the regular national security black box will, I think, be amplified by the non-transparency and often the inexplicability of AI algorithms. So these difficult national security questions that we already have are going to become even harder when the questions implicate AI tools. And yet, I think there will be pressure for national security agencies to do more and to do more faster because countries like Russia and China are pursuing this. We've seen important reports from high-profile commissions in the US, like the National Security Commission on AI, really worry about the US falling behind in this space and urging more progress faster. And yet, even today, when some of our machine learning systems have come to light, I'm thinking of some from the Department of Homeland Security, for example, US citizens have not been comfortable with the programs that they've developed and been using. Okay, so that's the problem. How do we address this double black box? Let me just say, this is not to say that we should not be introducing AI into our national security systems. It is instead to counsel that as we do so, I think we need a healthy set of checks against groupthink, carelessness, and so on. This is not the first time that we as a country are confronting challenges and trying to ensure that the US government's activity behind the veil of secrecy comports with our public law values. We have examples from the 70s and Watergate, for example, where we had some similarly challenging problems. So first, let me just offer a few ideas of what Congress could do. I think they're the kind of most obvious actor to do something here. In the US, we have several important framework statutes already on our books where Congress has decided that it wants to regulate risky or controversial national security activities. So, for example, we have a statute that regulates how the president can engage in covert action. We have a statute that regulates the conduct of foreign intelligence surveillance. And those statutes help give Congress a window into secret and sensitive executive actions that could lead to a foreign policy crisis or could intrude deeply into US citizens' rights. So I think Congress could use those kinds of statutes as a model for a new statute that would, for example, require the president himself or herself to sign off on high-risk uses of national security AI, presumably acting on recommendations from a range of national security agencies and their lawyers. Congress could also require the president to notify Congress of the approvals that he's made and to keep them informed of the outcomes of the systems that he's authorized. Congress could create what we call a joint committee in Congress. We have one on taxation. It's a sort of technical issue. Tax issues can kind of pervade a whole range of subject areas. We could create a joint committee on AI that would help inform all of the other committees about the nuances and questions that come up around AI. I think there are ways, that's Congress. There are other things I could say about that as well, but for purpose of time, I'll move on. I think the executive itself could self-regulate in helpful ways here. If it wanted to make sure that we had the right mix of agencies, the right mix of lawyers from those agencies, policymakers, operators, all involved in decisions about developing and deploying high-risk AI, there are models the executive could use. There's reportedly a process by which the executive, as an interagency, decides to recommend that the president engage in things like targeted killings or offensive cyber operations. So I think there are models out there that could be useful. the president could decide to set up dissent channels in each agency. The State Department already famously has one where it lets relatively junior people report concerns directly up to the Secretary of State. Other agencies could develop those kinds of things as well for when they see misuses of AI, serious misuses of AI inside their agencies. Non-traditional surrogates. Earlier, I mentioned that there are some actors we don't tend to think about as secrecy surrogates, but can do that, including foreign allies, tech companies, and states and localities. So let's consider foreign allies, for example. Thinking about foreign governments as surrogates for the US polity in relation to secret US government operations may seem counterintuitive. But I think allies do often have incentives, at least democratic allies who care about the rule of law, have incentives to prod the US to adhere to its own public law values. And these allies may have leverage over the executive, right? They can share or withhold intelligence. They can grant or withhold consent to use their territory or airspace or cyber infrastructure. And I think these allies benefit when in joint operations, the US executive is acting competently and lawfully. So how does that translate to ensuring that the US use of national security AI complies with public law values? Well, I think working out how AI or autonomous systems can comply with the laws of armed conflict is, for example, a complicated legal and technical issue, and one that discussions with peer militaries, very sort of open and transparent conversations with them can really help elucidate. So improving the legality piece, I think an ally could refuse to cooperate with the US military if US AI systems seem to violate their legal norms, or if the systems are so opaque that the ally can't be confident that the systems are law compliant. And they can also serve as a check on the quality and effectiveness of an AI system by refusing to cooperate if they're concerned the systems are technologically or morally unsound. And of course, the same thing is true for states other than the US. Those other states also have alliances and allies who might also be hopefully seeking to comply with their own public law values. Okay. Let me just say a little bit about international regulation. I'll just say that I have other prescriptive ideas for other sets of actors in the book, so I'm just kind of trying to provide a wave top view here. But let me just say a little bit about international regulation. So once you recognize that there is this challenge created by the double black box, you might immediately ask, well, is there a role for international agreements that could reduce the size of the double black box? That is, if states were to agree to take certain uses of national security AI off the table, that might mean a smaller double black box to worry about domestically. And while I think there is some work to be done on the international plane, I also think it's important not to overstate how successful it's going to be. As I started to research this, I realized that scholars often invoke nuclear arms control as the best analogy to possible international regulation of national security AI. And the argument goes like this: if the Soviet Union and the United States could reach agreement about this most powerful of weapons, that is nuclear weapons, then surely they and other states should be able to reach agreement about national security AI tools. I think the analogy doesn't work for a range of reasons, and I think the better analogy is to how international cyber regulation has transpired. I think that process has drawn on different buckets of tools to try to help shape norms and condemn pernicious cyber acts, but it has mostly not done so using international agreements, right? We have seen some modest nonlinear progress on developing cyber norms. And I think the buckets of tools that have been used in the cyber setting are also the buckets that will probably do some work in the national security AI space. So I think states will, and to some extent already have, agreed to apply existing international law. Although debates linger about how to interpret the rules. I think we've seen that in cyber. I think we've pretty much seen that in AI as well. Developing some new, although pretty vague norms among a wide group of states, right? We saw that with the UNGGE for cyber. I think we've seen this with lethal autonomous weapons and military uses of AI in the CCW process. I think we see some work in mini-lateral coalitions to try to develop some more specific norms and work through challenges privately. Here I'm thinking Five Eyes, NATO type groups. We see states making unilateral statements of law and policy in the cyber setting. I think we will see more of that in the AI space. We've seen states impose sanctions on bad cyber actors. I think we could also see states impose sanctions on bad AI actors, and maybe use criminal law on the margins. But I think getting the analogy right, again, I think the analogy is to cyber, not nuclear, getting that right and then understanding the possibilities and limits of international regulation, I think helps us think about where to focus our efforts. And these challenges in reaching substantive multilateral binding AI regulation shows, at least for me, the importance of getting our own checks and balances right on the domestic side. So let me wrap up. I think we currently face a real challenge posed by the double black box. I think there is no one silver bullet that is going to solve it, though I do think understanding it is a good place to start. We will need to look to our traditional overseers and our non-traditional overseers, so legislatures, courts, executive lawyers, allies, tech companies. All of these actors have some access to classified information and programs and technology and threats, and they all can potentially help enforce our public law values. And the public itself needs to signal to its democratic governments what kinds of national security tools it supports and which ones it wants our governments to avoid. So that means I think policymakers and lawyers and citizens need to understand the AI basics, need to be able to ask questions, sometimes hard questions of computer scientists, ensure that those who are crafting these AI systems understand the legal and policy frameworks in which their tools would be used. So I think it's a big, important, challenging job ahead of us, but it's one we have to take on. So I'll just pause there.